Ryan Thomas with EastWest here, and welcome to the 6th video in our EastWest Academy series, where we take you through the entire process of music production from beginning to end. And this is part 2 of our mini-series on MIDI programming. So we'll continue to break down the demo from part 1 along with a few other examples, but in this one we'll be focusing on articulation mapping, layering, and then finally runs and fast passages, which integrates pretty much all of the concepts we talked about in part 1, along with everything we're about to cover. So let's go ahead and get right into it. Articulation mapping really just comes down to knowing what the most appropriate articulation is for an instrument in a particular context. Now, plenty of composers out there like to use individual tracks, not just for individual instruments, but also their articulations. And that's definitely a viable workflow, but I think all things considered, I still prefer key switch patches like this Wagner tuba key switch patch. And if you're not familiar with how these patches work, they basically will load a variety of different articulations, and you can select between them using notes on the keyboard that are outside the range of the instrument. Now, most digital audio workstations allow you to use what are called articulation sets, and these basically make the process of editing and programming your articulation maps a little bit easier in most contexts. I actually find articulation sets to be pretty convenient. So, for example, in this trombone passage, I can select all of these notes, and I can set them to simple sustains. Now, obviously, that didn't sound quite right. Those two short notes really should have been short and punchy articulations like staccato or staccatissimo. So I'm going to go ahead and select these two notes, and then in this drop-down menu, I'm going to select staccatissimo. So now. Now, you can also just use key switches manually, so these notes up top are my key switch notes, and then these are, of course, the notes that the low strings are actually playing. So both methods obviously achieve the same result. The only thing that's really different is going to be the workflow. Now, articulation mapping is absolutely crucial to achieving a realistic result and a result that just sounds good. So let's go ahead and play this from measure 36, and we're going to follow what the first violins are doing. And honestly, the articulation mapping in this piece is what I would even consider to be relatively simple. So we've got the violin key switch patch playing up until measure 44, and they're going to be playing a tremolo. Then the violins are going to switch to some shorts, and then we're going to play some runs right before 51, go back to shorts, and then go back to some runs at measure 54, and then at 55, they're going to be playing some shorts, and then at 57, you've got this line in the legato violins, and then we're ending on a tremolo. So let's go ahead and hear it. Now, if you're wondering why I have the violin, legato, shorts, and key switch patch all on different tracks, that's just because I like to, number one, process the shorts a little bit differently from the other articulations, and then I like to have individual tracks for the legato strings just for my own personal workflow. So let's talk about just some practical tips that you can use to bring more life and realism to your compositions. And we'll start with brass. So oftentimes the low brass, like your tubas and your trombones, are pretty much just there to support the chord for the rest of the orchestra. So here at measure 15, we didn't really need these two short notes in order to be effective. So let's go ahead and remove those. I'm just going to extend this, and let's hear it. So that worked just fine, but if you want to add a little bit more color and emotional impact to those low brass lines, try throwing in some shorts here and there. So let's go ahead and undo what I just did and then hear it in context. So I just think that sounded so much better, and it fit the emotion of that moment better. Key switching in your timpani can also add just a ton of color and life to your pieces. So we're switching between just some hits and then a sustained roll. And by the way, this CC1 data doesn't affect any of the hits. It only affects the sustained roll. So you can see where the dynamics are increasing here to represent a crescendo into that last hit at 18. And then in context. So that's an articulation pattern that I really like to use a lot with timpani, especially for these big orchestral crescendos. Now there's so much that you can do with just the short articulations. So you might remember this piece from the videos that we did on orchestration, but this entire melody that is being played by the various instrument groups from measure 10 to 21 is being played with just a variety of shorts of different lengths. So you've got the staccatissimo, staccato, staccato on bow, which is only for strings, and then of course marcato. Now of course strings also have spiccato, but I'm not using them in this particular passage. So let's go ahead and hear it in context, and then we'll break it down. So again, that entire melody line was just being played by various shorts. Now in the strings, the CC1 data is selecting between the various lengths of shorts. So basically, the higher the CC1 data, the longer the short is. So it goes from staccatissimo to staccato on bow, and then at the highest value, you've got marcato. So let's go ahead and give it a listen. Now in the brass, which is carrying the melody in the next phrase, I'm just using a regular key switch patch. So the different articulations are going to be selected using just key switches. Now, because I'm using an articulation set, you won't actually see those key switch notes in the MIDI data, but that's essentially how this patch is operating. So let's go ahead and hear the French horns. And I'm going to switch to the articulations matrix so that you can see exactly what's happening. Now in the woodwinds, I'm also using key switch patches with articulation sets, but I'm also making use of the legato slur runs in addition to the shorts. So let's switch to the articulations matrix so again you can see what's going on. So again, there's just so much that you can do with these shorts, beyond just ostinatos or hits. They work well even for melodic passages like this. In fact, I'd say in this context, they work ideally. And, I get asked a lot if I have to write my demos to the limitations of the library. And my answer is always unequivocally, absolutely not. I've never really had an idea that these instruments weren't able to execute well, just because these EastWest libraries come with so many beautifully recorded and performed articulations. So layering is the practice of combining patches together to produce a more realistic or just ear-pleasing result. It's a little bit different from orchestral doubling in that it pretty much just addresses something on a more technical level. So for example, if you have a strings patch that sounds really good, but the legato's a little bit weak, you might layer that with a string patch that sounds a little bit thin, but has really great legato. So they're kind of essentially making up for each other's weaknesses. I don't really find myself doing that with most EastWest libraries. So if I am layering, it's pretty much just to produce something that's a little bit more colorful or more interesting. So one thing you can do is layer solo strings with ensemble strings. This can kind of give you the effect of having an individually mic'd first chair. So I'm going to go ahead and mute the solo violin and solo cello first so that we can hear what this sounds like just with the ensemble strings. And now let's add in the solo strings. So if you're looking for a little bit more definition and texture, adding those solo strings can definitely be a good choice. Now, Hollywood Fantasy Orchestra has given us some really, really cool layering options. So for example, this cello line felt pretty good. I think it works, but I think it could use a little bit more edge to the sound. In this context, it just feels a little bit too soft. So now let's go ahead and add that viola da gamba. And I pretty much just copy and pasted the cello MIDI data into the viola da gamba track. So I think both passes sounded pretty good, but I like the sound of the viola da gamba in that part. I think it kind of fit the emotion of that moment really beautifully. Now we're also doing the same thing with the Hardanger fiddles and the violin melody at measure 19. So let's hear it without the Hardanger fiddle first. And now let's go ahead and unmute the Hardanger fiddles. So the fiddles there are definitely giving that melody more definition, and it's just adding such a cool texture to this part. Now I'm doing something that's just a bit offbeat in this section. I've got violins 1 and 2 playing tremolos with the legato sim mode enabled. And honestly, these weren't really meant to be used like that, so they don't sound quite right by themselves. So I went ahead and layered the full violin sections with some divisi violin sections that are also playing tremolos, but they are non-legato. So you get that legato transition, but it's kind of masked by the non-legato samples. So let's hear the full sections with the divisi sections. So that's already sounding better. Now let's hear it in context. So that is one example of how you can use layering to produce kind of a unified sound that's more than the sum of its parts. So now let's talk about layering percussion, which is absolutely huge in modern music production, especially when it comes to, those big epic sci-fi or fantasy soundtracks or something like that. So these taikos sound pretty good on their own. So again, those sound amazing on their own, but let's try rounding out the bottom end with the grand casas from Hollywood Fantasy Percussion. So I'm just going to copy and paste these into this track, and that should actually work. So immediately you can hear that there's so much more low-end presence in the sound, which I think, in this context is better than either the taikos or just the grand casas on their own. Now, if we wanted to add a bit more high-end presence, we could try copying this down to the snares, and let's hear what this sounds like. And I really do love this snare ensemble from Hollywood Fantasy Percussion. So let's go ahead and unmute this. And now let's hear these in context. Now, the driving mid percussion here is the 3 Balron patch from Hollywood Fantasy Percussion. So let's hear that by itself. And if we wanted to add a little bit more presence to that, we can go ahead and copy and paste this down into the shaker track. And then I'm just going to move all of these down to C2, and then we're going to move all of these down to C0. I'm sorry, C1. There we go. So let's hear this with the Balrons. So now we have this really cool driving percussive element that doesn't just sound like a shaker, and it doesn't just sound like the Balrons. So now let's hear these in context. And that's really just scratching the surface when it comes to layering percussion. We could really do 10 videos on that alone. But if you want to create those big cinematic hits, as a general rule of thumb, you'll want a mid element like the taikos, which I would classify those as more of like a mid/low element. And then you want a dedicated low element like the grand kasas. And oftentimes you'll want a treble element like the snares. I went ahead and made this the last section because it integrates most of the concepts that we've talked about in MIDI programming part 1, as well as this video. Articulation mapping, layering, CC1, CC11, all play into writing convincing runs. Now, the first thing you'll want to do is make sure that a vanilla legato patch won't be able to play it. You know, EastWest instruments are pretty legendary for their very agile and convincing true legato, so you might be surprised what you can get away with. Take this passage, for instance. At this tempo, this is actually quite fast. I don't know that I would necessarily call this a run per se, but as you can hear, it is very fast. So that definitely worked, and it worked quite well. Now take note of the CC1 data. You can see where it's kind of swelling and then decrescendoing and then swelling. And that's kind of matching the movement of the notes. As they ascend, the sound swells, and as they descend, it tends to fall off just a little bit. Let's hear it again. So CC1 is obviously playing a huge role. And by the way, in this patch, CC1 controls both dynamics and vibrato. So now let's hear this in context. So again, before you start reaching for those specific runs articulations, make sure that just a regular legato patch won't be able to play it. So let's talk about these big runs at the beginning. They definitely were too fast for the regular legato patch, which is why we have the legato slur runs articulation. And I'm not really doing anything too fancy here, other than just making sure that I'm breathing some life and realism into the passage with CC1 and CC11. Now, in context, those are probably actually going to sound fine, but they're going to sound even better when layered with woodwinds. So this is a really significant application for layering. So again, with the woodwinds, we're just using the legato slur runs articulation, but as you saw, there's still plenty of action in CC11. Now, adding harp is going to further blend the string and woodwind runs together for just a more cohesive sound. So let's hear the strings, woodwinds, and harp. So now let's hear how all of these elements work in context. So now let's take a look at the runs that we just heard at the end of that passage. So here in measure 16 and 17, you have these ascending runs in the violins as well as the woodwinds. Let's check out what's going on in the strings first. And we are doing some key switching here, switching between some staccato slur runs and some legato slur runs. So I'm going to have the articulation matrix open so you can see exactly what's happening and when. So in general, you really want the beginning and the end of those ascending or descending runs to kind of pop, which is why we have those staccato notes at the beginning and end of those ascents. And as an oboe player myself, when I go to play a run, you'll hear the first note very clearly, you'll hear the last note very clearly, and everything else in between is pretty much just going to be a blur. So the way that you accent certain notes in a run is really going to play into their perceived realism. Now you'll see pretty much the same articulation pattern in the woodwinds. And here they are with both violin 1 and 2. Now, one other thing I'm doing is ending the runs with a pre-recorded run from symphonic orchestra. They sound like this by themselves. That's the flute, and this is the piccolo. So here are the strings with all the woodwinds, including those layered pre-recorded runs. So that's another great application of layering. Now, quite frankly, I think the runs sounded pretty convincing even before we added the pre-recorded runs from symphonic orchestra. But if I can add those and get away with it, I usually will. Now let's go ahead and hear these runs with the harp. And then in the context of the full mix. Now, there are a couple of other layering tricks that you can use to add some additional color and realism to your runs. So here at measure 54, let's go ahead and hear what's going on in the violins. So in terms of the articulation mapping, it's pretty similar to the runs that we just looked at a minute ago. And the woodwinds are pretty much doing the same thing. Again, we're pretty much just using all the same concepts from the run that we just looked at, but we are also layering these with a tambourine shake and a mark tree gliss. So let's hear the runs in the woodwinds and the strings by themselves, and then we'll add the percussion. Okay, and then let's go ahead and add the tambourine shake and that mark tree gliss. So now. And let's also add the harp. So that tambourine shake and the gliss are just kind of accenting the end of that run and making it sparkle in the context of the full mix. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and hear how this sounds with everything unmuted. Now, you can also use short articulations like staccato or staccato on bow when programming runs, especially at the lower velocity. So if an instrument doesn't include a specific runs articulation, I wouldn't necessarily consider that a limiting factor. So for example, here at measure 16, the violas are playing the same runs as the first and second violins, but we're just using the mod speed patch. So let's hear these with the staccato articulation triggered. Now, that didn't sound quite right, so let's try triggering the staccato on bow articulation by just increasing that CC1 value. So I think that definitely works. You know, you might need to fine-tune the velocities a little bit. Keep in mind that same principle where you want those accents usually at the beginning and the end of either an ascending or descending run. So now let's hear these in context. So these patches are just incredibly flexible. And of course, all of the instruments that were used to produce this piece, as well as all the other examples in this video, are included with a Composer Cloud Plus subscription, which also includes every single instrument EastWest has ever made. It is a massively powerful and expansive tool. So that is going to do it for this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like it, drop a comment, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any future content. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.